welcome back to Everyday Anarchism. I'm your host, Graham Culbertson, and this is another episode in the series that I'm calling Radicalism in the American Revolution, although that's not quite right. This is more like radicalism in the American revolutions. And before I say any more, I'll just let my guest go ahead and introduce himself in the book, and we'll go from there.
Thanks, Graham. And first of all, thanks for having me. So I'm Arturo Chang. I'm a assistant professor of political theory at the University of Toronto. Well, I can tell you quickly, my research is mostly focused on popular movements, revolutions, nation building in the Americas. And so the book, the title is A New World of Revolutions, Popular Imaginations and Movements Across the Americas. As you probably can already tell, it fits exactly what I do in my other work more generally. And the book is invested in thinking about how revolutions across the region, across the hemisphere, were actually connected movements. At least that's the premise. I'm sure we'll get into the rest of it in a sec.
Yeah, excellent, great. No, that's a great start. I love it. I love this idea. As I get to, well, I guess I'll just go. I mean, this is a big challenge to me for a lot of reasons, and the first one is just like, I don't know, my degree is called American literature, by
Yeah.
by which they mean literature in English in the United States, or written in English in colonies that later became the United States. So we'll read John Smith in a introduction to an American literature class, even though John Smith was not an American. He was British. And
Mm.
and Virginia became part of the United States. Now, I happen to be born in the state of Florida, as Florida, I think there's a nicer pronunciation than Florida, but that's where I'm from. So I say Florida. There were also Europeans writing at the same time as John Smith in Florida. They do not count as American literature because they were writing in the wrong language. So
Mhm.
I can't help it. I mean, when I introduce myself at conferences, I say I'm an Americanist, by which I mean a student of the English writing of British colonists and then people in the United States of America. And it gets complicated when people move to the United States of America and write in English. And it's like, oh my God, is Nabokov and do Americanists study Nabokov? It's so confusing.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. Yeah.
But we have this other thing that is, America, or the Americas, which is the entire hemisphere. And I'm going to sneak this in, and then I'll stop blathering in a second. One time I was in Europe. I was on a group of I was touring with a group of teachers. I was a high school teacher at the time, and we were learning how to lead tours, and it was mostly Spanish teachers because it's mostly people who are going to try and get students to travel with to learn the culture of the foreign language they're studying, which in America
Mhm.
it's mostly Spanish. At least it was back in the day. And I just
Mm.
casually, I was talking to our guide and said, like, oh man, we're in Berlin. Look at this. You would never see this in America. And one of the Spanish teachers was like, you mean you would never see this in the United States? Like, she was just like, how
Yeah.
dare you?
Yeah.
And so I just want to start. What do we do with this word, America, which can be just descriptive, can be hegemonic, can be
Mm.
expansive, can be narrow? Because you wrote about the Americas, and that just cuts with my political instincts, but against my disciplinary instincts, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, thanks. I think this is a great place to start because, um, you know, just to first begin with the example you brought up, the reaction when I talk about this book in the United States versus basically anywhere else in the Americas is very different. And precisely along the lines of what you outlined, right? Latin Americans, the reaction is usually like, well, yes, of course, we're all Americans. Um, and people in the US a lot of times are a little confused, and we gotta kind of like establish terms. And the thing is, I think both reactions are understandable and relevant. And I think that part of what the book is trying to encourage people to think about in a, let's say, in a contemporary sense beyond the historiography, is precisely to think about the words, the terms, and the categories that we still use today, and where they came from, right? And so, uh, when it comes to field conventions like literature, uh, I can tell you that I love to do this in my own field in political theory, where I've purposely started saying, I think we'll talk about this later, American political thought as a tradition that's from the Americas. And when I, or if I get some pushback, I think a very easy counterexample is saying the way that we use, the category European thought or European literature, which doesn't erase idiosyncrasies, but it does kind of address some of the shared conditions, ideas, motivations that do create what we might recognize as a tradition, right? The European tradition. I think the American tradition should operate similarly. Um, but then we get into kind of, as you were pointing to, the politics of language and how, hegemony, regional power also affects the way that language evolves. And in that sense, um, it's not particularly surprising that people in the U.S. have gotten used to using America to mean the United States. Um, but I think it's a point that we should interrogate and maybe become more uncomfortable with than we are, at least so that when we go to Europe, we don't go through those embarrassing moments, right, of realizing that the rest of the world thinks of it differently.
Yeah, I always say the states now, and I've learned in Europe that's usually what people say. They say like, "Oh, we were in the states." They don't say we
No,
were in America if they were traveling in the United States. So I've gotten better at that. But it's unavoidable for me. My degree is literally in American literature, and let me tell you
yeah,
that does not include literature from Latin America. I mean, again, there's of course exceptions, and there's all sorts of wonderful people redefining what American literature means. But when you open up that American literature textbook, actually, this will get us into something else. Those American literature anthologies, which I haven't taught an American literature survey for a little while, or
hmm
United States Literature Survey to use it properly. But again, that's not what it's called. It's called in the catalog Survey of
yeah, yeah.
American Literature. They now start with indigenous or Indian myths, but they're almost always written down by a European from the 19th century. And I never really know what to do with them. In some ways, I'm more comfortable with the old hegemonic model because it's like it'll be like 1,200 pages of English written by mostly Europeans or their descendants. And then there's
Mm,
like 5 pages at the beginning. It's like, oh, by the way, there were some people here before and they're also Americans. And here's 5 pages for them. And that always like
yeah,
confuses the
yeah.
hell out of me. Because I'm like, wait,
Mm,
if these people, if the people who came before the Europeans are truly a substantial part of the American story, then they should make up 9/10 of the book, 99/100 of the book. This is ridiculous.
yeah,
And so
yeah,
just throwing
yeah.
them in at the beginning strikes me as absurd. It's like, oh, so you want to have the hegemonic project, but pretend that you're not having the hegemonic project. I think that's what those 5 pages of Native American myths are doing there.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great example, and I think that you're right to say that there's this double move of wanting to problematize hegemony, and I think another one is wanting to problematize the nation state, while also constantly, uh, resigning ourselves to the nation state being this kind of like all-encompassing, all-organizing category. When if say we want to keep the conventions of literature as they are, in your example, we could just call it Anglophone literature,
Yes,
right?
we
Uh,
could.
but and I think that for me it was saying, okay, if we're going to stick with the word America and American, let's take seriously its roots as a conditional category, which is to say, the people, the politics, the cultures, the practices that emerged in the conditions of, the so-called New World. But, and as you saw in the book, I use the hemisphere.
Yeah.
Um, and to me, that feels relatively simple, at least like in a vernacular linguistic sense, right? It's like, all these groups and people were thinking and living in this region. And so the connections intuitively make sense. But then the next part of changing our habits and our language, that becomes harder, right? Because then we're talking about habits, and habits are hard to change.
Yeah, they are hard to change, and and that's why books like this are so important. I was about to say something in really academic language, and I try to make this podcast as approachable to non-academics as possible. So let me try and kind of step this back. The 20th century nation state is the telos, which is just the Greek word for like the goal. It's like the project of almost all history done in the second half of the 20th century and much of the history done in the 21st century. So when a
Hmm.
historian sits down to write a book, in most cases, if they're a historian of Mexico or the United States or Spain, or Germany or China or wherever, they're like, okay, this thing exists now that is called China, that has these boundaries, that has this political structure. And my goal is to explain to you how this thing came to exist. And it's not that there's
Hmm.
anything wrong with that. I know I'm making a very broad claim, but I also think it's true. And I've had historians on the show who agree. This is the goal. How did we get these nation states? What do they do? The idea that and there's nothing wrong with doing that history, but that means any alternative way of seeing the world, anything that didn't result in a nation state, any movements that didn't result in a nation state, any future alternative political renderings that might not be the nation state, they just like don't exist for most historians of the past 50 or 60 years.
Mm.
We start in wherever you start. You can start in 1807 or you can start in 1107 BC, but where you're going is the parliamentary democracy that exists right now as I write. It's crazy.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, I totally agree. I mean, I agree with you. I'm going to try to not make this super jargony. The way I would put it, and I think I feel free to do this because I'm not a historian, right? Is that national history, or let me say, nationalized histories,
Mm.
are not a matter of record. They are a project in themselves, right? We're not simply recording, uh, the emergence of something as powerful as a nation state. The nation state, as an institution, as a project, as a set of practices, creates this idea of national history, which then we begin to reify, right? And it's not like historians are not being accurate. I think they are being accurate, but it's about the kind of interpretive parameters we use to think about things that have happened in the world. Um, and so when I began writing the book, um, one of my goals was to try to evade the kind of like um, I don't know, maybe we can call it like the nationalism glasses, right? The lens, right?
Yeah.
Which, to be clear, I'm not claiming that I fully did. It's very difficult to do. Ultimately, the book is more or less organized by what we could then recognize as states. Um, but it was more about trying to stay really close to the on the ground investments of the people involved in these movements, and I think that that's how we can get to some degree close to problematizing the centrality of the nation state in a period like the age of revolutions. Even the way we talk about revolutions, right? It's really hard to talk about revolutions without thinking about it as the foundation of the state, uh, which is simply not true, right? We can get into the historiography, but even the U.S. Revolution doesn't start with the goal of establishing a nation state, right? And so that's true for pretty much every one of these movements. We do have an outcome, which is the emergence of the state, and the way that we deal with that, I think, is truly up to us. It doesn't have to be a reification of kind of the maybe like the determinate outcome of the state as the end goal. If that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yes. No, that's absolutely right. And just for people following along with me in the American Revolution or the United States Revolution series, one way to put this is the the British government has 26 colonies in the New World. We talk about 13 colonies because the state that we are a part of was made up of 13 of those 26 colonies. We just have to pretend those other 13 colonies didn't exist because we're wearing our
Yeah.
nationalizing glasses. In our nationalizing glasses, there were 13 colonies, and probably there was some other colonies. Who knows? It doesn't really matter that much because they ended up outside of the bucket called the United States, and that's just such a
Yeah.
challenge for us who have been brought up in these wearing these glasses, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah. That's a great example. Exactly.
So I wanted to ask you. I want to know if you saw this book, "The Dawn of Everything" by Graeber and Wingrove, because they do this wild thing that I'd never seen before. Like they do talk about American political theory or American political thought, and their claim they talk a lot about I think his name is Kondirong, who is this uh, supposedly a made up speaker who, you know, he was a real person, but he's supposedly just a character that a European made up and made all of these liberal Enlightenment claims for. And Gueber and Ringo say no, actually, the real guy Kondirong probably might have said those. My favorite example is Montaigne, the French writer, writes about the Tupinamba people in Brazil and basically says like all of their institutions are better than ours. And again, that's usually read as like Montaigne sort of making up critiques of Europe rather than actually thinking that there's a better society out there.
Mm,
So
mm,
I'm interested in this idea of using the applying the word American or American political thought not to Europeans who have settled in what will become the states of America, but for the various people from the various nations before European. Should we? I mean, it's obviously meant by Graeber and Winker to be this really subversive,
mm,
fun thing. You know, I don't know
mm.
how you feel about it.
Yeah. So, after when I got a sense of what you might ask me, and I saw the Wengrow, Graeber and Wengrow. I had this moment of, yeah, of course. I um I actually cite that work and I engage with it in this article on the influence of indigenous nations and indigenous politics on the Enlightenment era, especially Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. But somehow that connection didn't actually come back to the book. Um, and you know, I so okay, to answer your question directly on using American, um, I am not against using American as a kind of geographic and conditional category that indigenous peoples do eventually engage with. And by the 18th century, we see a lot of indigenous intellectuals using the language of uh, for example, natural Americans, right?
Mm,
To say that they are the natural kind of like purest Americans of the period. And that becomes a politically important claim for them. Um, I think I'm more comfortable with contextualizing the connection between indigenous groups and the American identity in that way, rather than what we were talking about earlier, where indigenous groups just kind of get lumped into the trajectory of the
yeah.
emergence of the United States. That said, I don't have a super strong opinion on the Graeber and Wenger book, apart from the fact that it's incredibly ambitious and just like it was a fun read.
Yeah.
Um, I understand some of the critiques that they made of the book, but when you're writing a work like that, you're gonna get lots of critiques. I mean, it's literally called the dawn of everything, right? So, I appreciated the approach. And I think that there is, uh, I like the claim that American thinkers were producing some of the most innovative or important changes in political ideas in the colonial period into the Enlightenment, or what we call the early modern period. Um, I think where I don't use quite the same language is that I don't really think of political ideas as being invented. I like to think of them more as kind of a convergent set of ideas and practices which evolve over time. But I don't see this like moment of foundation, which, of course, if it's the dawn of everything, you're looking for that, right? So I think that's one of the differences.
Yeah, and I mean, it's that book. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say about that book. I've done multiple episodes on it, but this question of what they mean by the dawn of everything, and how they're obviously at least partially kidding, but
Yeah.
but
And it also sounds great, right? Like that's part of book writing. So,
yeah.
I mean, it worked, right?
Oh yeah, I
They
mean,
got so much attention. So,
I know. Yeah, they did, and I would have thought that Graeber would have never written a book that got as much attention as the Debt book did, which is just what made his name. But then the Dawn of Everything, just as near as I can tell, blew Debt out of the water because it's so. I like Debt a lot better, but I find the Dawn of Everything so intellectually engaging. I mean, it used to be. I think we're mostly done with this, but it used to be that there was like this whole cottage industry that you could just pick one of Foucault's examples that Foucault writes like a paragraph about, and then you write like an entire book going into the details and explaining what Foucault got wrong, which of course
yeah,
he
yeah.
did because Foucault's books cover the dawn of everything also basically. And I feel like that like the Graeber Wingrove books, like that's what everyone wants to do is they read this paragraph. And I mean, I did it too. You read a paragraph in that book that you know a lot about, and you're like, I want to set the record straight on this, but we're talking about hundreds of thousands of us have read this book. So yeah, we know a lot more collectively than Graeber and Wingrove did. Choosing any two of us who wrote a book that had as much in it as Dawn of Everything, that's hard to believe.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I totally agree with that. Like, writing a book like that is just difficult, right? And it's easy to critique it. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
and
yeah.
and more people should do it. That's the thing that bugs me is people seem to want fewer of these big books, and I want more of these big books, although of course I am very skeptical of some of these master narratives as they are called. It's right there in the name.
Yeah, yeah. No, I agree. People should write big books. And I don't at all want to claim that my book is close to the Graver and Wengrow, but I do think that some of the reactions I get for this book is a little like, this is a big connections book, and it's an uncomfortable place to sit at times, but at the same time, I think it's fun to write big ideas.
Yeah, and look, I mean, I just want to say in terms of your book, it's it's obvious. I mean, I think if you said to someone there was something called the Age of Revolutions, and it swept, everyone agrees there's something called the Age of Revolutions, and it swept Europe, and it was, intracontinental. All through that continent, people were moving and shaking. And the most famous example. This is later, but when Italy is finally unified, the hero of the unification, Garibaldi, the place where he's from decides to become French and not Italian. So like,
Yeah, yeah.
this Age of Revolutions is not a national thing. It's broader. You've got 1789 matters in so many different countries. 1848 matters in so many different countries. I think the idea of hemispheric or continental Age of Revolutions, that's just intuitive and everyone agrees on it.
Hmm.
Everyone agrees on it as well, I think, for Latin America and the Caribbean. But there's this
Hmm.
one goddamn country that that just has to be special, that doesn't want to be part of an Age of Revolutions, or if it's part of the Age of Revolutions, it's the transatlantic Age of Revolutions. Not
Yeah.
the hemispheric America Age of Revolutions. So you can talk about Lafayette and the hero of two worlds, but we don't want to associate Toussaint, Bolivar, and Jefferson all at the same time. That's just weird. One of these things is not like the other. One of them is an American, and I think it's obvious that that grouping, Louverture, Bolivar, and Jefferson, goes together, but that people don't want to hear that. At least people in the United States do not want to hear that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree. I think this is a very simple argument, right? And as I was writing it, I definitely had moments where it felt kind of like, this is an obvious point. And yet, why does it make people so uncomfortable? When I present the second chapter on Mexican Texas, right? And, I've given a couple of talks from that chapter, and when I say, the first Republic of Texas is Mexican, and the first founder of Texas was Mexican, and he had support from the Madison administration, right? And that immediately kind of throws a wrench into the conversation. And people tell me like, I've never heard about this. I'm from Texas. I can't believe that I didn't know this. But as you were saying, is it really surprising that as an independence movement gathered in what is today current day Mexico, and an independence movement was already established and underway in the US, that they didn't end up, or is it surprising that they did end up meeting, right, and collaborating when they had a mutual interest in avoiding reconquest, right? So, in a political, material, and social sense, and also in the context of like political imagination, it makes absolute sense. It's completely unsurprising. And so then I think for me, it became a project of kind of problematizing the language and the categories that we use to think about these periods, and to say, let's step aside from the nationalism and the states that emerge. Let's just talk about why these people were collaborating and what the investments were and how they shared them. And then we, ultimately also understand how we get to where we are now. But I think it's important to first remember that that's what this world was like. Yeah, no, I agree. I like that it's a simple story to tell. It's easier, I think, to get people on board that way.
Yeah, and I think it's just, I mean, I don't want to go back to this too often, but I mean, this is where I started our talk, and it's still there. We are doing history, and I say we, and I mean historians, but of course also, I mean, I'm doing this series because it's the 250th anniversary, which it's not really. 1776 is one of many important years, but
Mm,
the goal is to get from 1776 to right now and explain what the United States is and why it is so important in the world. I mean,
yeah,
that is the goal of history education in the United States. And of course, these days at least, it's not only that. And even I'm 43. I had a curriculum from International Baccalaureate where my junior year was not American history, it was history of the Americas. But I don't
mm.
know what percentage of American high school students got history of the Americas instead of AP US history. I would guess we're in the
Yeah, I did not for sure.
yeah, it's way down in the percentiles. So your story, I mean, this is another thing that I should just apologize for saying over and over again. But the American education system is designed to tell pretty simple stories and reify them. Let me tell you, just as an aside, I'm reading this book called Against Money right now, which is a really fantastic book inspired in part by Graeber's work Against Money. And I was telling, a bit of it to my wife, and my daughter, who is in fourth grade, was like, "Oh, that's interesting. We learned about where money came from and what it does in school, and they said the exact opposite of what you just said." And I was like, "Yep, like this is an
Yeah.
incredibly common point in my household is I'll say something and my kids are like, they taught us the exact opposite thing in school. So something like the United States Revolution was part of a wave of revolutions sweeping the Americas that all resulted ultimately in independence. That's probably pretty much the exact opposite of how the American Revolution is taught in school.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, I did schooling in the US and in Mexico. Um, and I think in the process of doing the research for this project, I had to kind of unlearn both curriculums. Uh, and it's just because, every government has gotten, unsurprisingly, because it's important for the legitimacy of the state, on board with the project of national history, right?
Yeah.
Uh, but I agree. And I think, some reactions I've gotten too is that I'm trying to decenter the US as this important part of the story. But I think the book is actually showing the opposite. It shows that the US, well, to be more precise, the revolutionary movement that leads to the US, um, it inspires a lot of people, right? In the hemisphere, and we have a lot of Americans from other parts of the in today Latin America saying, you all were able to start doing this, and so we can start doing it too, and it becomes this domino effect of commiserating anti-colonial movements, in which the U.S. is an important part of the story, but the US is not the only story of the region. And I think that that's how we begin to kind of walk back on what, a quote unquote American tradition means, where it comes from, who's a part of that, um, and ultimately coming to the conclusion that that tradition cannot be a nation state centered one for that reason, right? But yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
no, I think that's absolutely right, and I really appreciate you writing this book. I mean, I in keep
Thanks.
in keeping with my training, this is going to be one of relatively few episodes I make that are not devoted to the United States. But it's just sort of I have to hope that some younger people come along and listen to people like you and me talking. I didn't have, despite the fact that I mentioned that I took a history of the Americas, I also remember that all myself and my classmates and our parents were all just like, "What is this bullshit? Like, why, like,
Yeah, yeah.
why do they need to know who O'Higgins is? Shouldn't they just be learning about Madison and that? Like,
Yeah,
we've got
yeah, totally.
a long way to go to do this kind of work and make it be normal to see the United States as a nation among many.
Yeah, no, it's denationalizing our minds is very difficult. I teach in Canada, right? I'm at the University of Toronto. When I first started, it was so difficult for me to stop using the US as my point of reference,
Yeah.
right? And and of course my students would get frustrated and say something like, "You're in Canada," and understandably.
Yeah.
And so, I get it. I do it too. It's tough. And really I think that it's a good example of what hegemonic power means, right? Being unable to escape even in our imagination, the way that we think, being unable to escape the boundaries of the state. Um, I mean, it's impressive, right? It's part of why these states still exist today, right? But it's important, I think, to try to step outside of it when we can.
Yeah, important and, as you say, difficult. The one last thing that I want to make sure we get to, and then we can go wherever you want to finish up. Is this? Well, again, I'll do a little bit longer on this. There's there's a problem with the American Revolution or the United States Revolution. Everyone knows it by now, though the Trump administration is trying to hide it, which is it's a revolution in the name of freedom. and it's
Mm,
also a revolution in the name of imperialism. And
mm,
I
mm-hmm,
I did a lot of work in my dissertation on Washington D.C., and I went back and read like letters that George Washington and Pierre Charles L'Enfant, the designer of DC, wrote to each other, and they were very clear that the goal was an imperial capital. They didn't think that a enlightened republic and an empire were incompatible. In fact, they used the phrase republican empire over and over again. And
mm,
so,
mm-hmm.
you know, when people walk around with American flags and 1776 and don't tread on me, there's definitely, obviously, those things are ostensibly about freedom and rebellion and anti imperialism. Also, I think most of the world, certainly the vast majority of the world on the left, sees the American flag and American liberty in 1776 and don't tread on me to mean the the precise opposite, to mean imperialism and to mean hegemony. And your book,
Mm.
I think, calls this essentially anti-colonial and neo-colonial practices, and shows that, as we all know, they're woven together. Someone like George Washington is anti being under the thumb of the British and very pro other people being under his thumb.
Yeah.
So this is anti-colonial and neo-colonial, and you wrote really persuasively and really interestingly in the book about how this idea, these two practices together, just runs all through this world, this hemisphere of revolutions.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for pointing to that. And I'm glad that that point sounded interesting to you. I think your explanation is great. The way that I would add to it is by saying that the um, the compatibility between anti-colonial revolution and republicanism, um, and then on the other side, neo-colonial imperialism or expansion, is precisely one of the characteristic features of what I'm trying to define as the American tradition in
Mm-hmm.
the hemisphere. And that is because pretty much every leader in the region is thinking of developing the same type of state, right? And justifying very similar types of social hierarchies, right? Which is the rejection of arbitrary rule by Europeans, but the maintenance of um, social stratification in which Creoles are at the top, right?
Mm-hmm.
Creoles meaning, people like Alexander Hamilton, people of European descent born in the Americas, right? And my friend and colleague Josh Simon at Hopkins, he has a very interesting book on this called The Ideology of Creole Revolution. So um, I think we miss the compatibility precisely because we tend to think in binaries,
Mm-hmm.
right? Of colonialism, anti colonialism, right? Or absolute emancipation through revolution and subjection. And I think what we can find in this period through the historiography is precisely that because all of these movements were emerging in what at the time felt like entirely novel contexts and conditions, right? Natural conditions that the world had never seen before, the world meaning the world of the early modern period. Uh, and, territory that was unprecedented, um, agriculture that was unprecedented, right? Production that was unprecedented. The immediate response is yes. I'm going to put this, very simple, like I'm paraphrasing. It's basically, yes, we don't like European rule. We don't like the arbitrary dimensions of being colonized, but we have so much space and production capabilities. Why wouldn't we create these massive states that don't exist anywhere else and that we might imagine will be very powerful? And so, unsurprisingly, and I think we can all relate to this, these people begin to find a way to rationalize the compatibility of expansion and rejecting colonial rule. And they do it very quickly and very easily. Uh, So I think that in the book, this is one another facet that should be largely unsurprising, right? They justify their vision, and I would say that that vision is distinctly American.
Yeah, no, that's that was really interesting and really stood out to me in the book and seemed really accurate. It also has led to this thing that still exists, and that I, at least from my anarchist perspective, are very frustrated by this idea that imperialism is bad because it involves one group of people. Sorry, let's say one type of people ruling over another type of people, and the problem is not the ruling but the type. And this is sort of, as you say, it's like, oh, these people are arbitrarily different from us and they're in charge. If you're a Creole, which is not a term we use in the United States, but you're absolutely right, the term applies. And so, I mean, it's used in Louisiana, right? It's used
Yeah,
in
very
places.
differently. Yeah.
Yes, but Creole meaning someone who is American by birth, but European by heritage, then the rule, the fact that, I mean, George Washington, all George Washington wanted, for those of you who don't know this, all he wanted was to be a really powerful member of the British Empire in good standing. And they let him know that he could be a really powerful colonial member of the British Empire. And that really rankled. And so the reaction, which is, oh, Americans should rule America, Americans for America, is a very potent political idea, but it will not get you out of systems of power and rule and domination, at least not by itself. And I have
Mm.
seen so many Western intellectuals praising, anti-colonial movements, when the people doing those anti-colonial movements have no desire to liberate that country, but just wish to substitute a different form of, we might call it Creole, or a similar form of colonialism. And I must admit,
Hmm.
it's really daunting. And then you don't want to stand up and say, like, no, like, you can sound a little bit too much like the French imperial apologists when I'm not trying to say that the French should rule Africa. This is a silly thing. Let the record show I'm not trying to say that the French should rule Africa. But kicking the French out of Africa does not mean that what's left is a good rule Africa for the Africans. You'll find it's Africa for certain Africans, and
Hmm.
and conditions very similar to those under the French for other Africans. And I think we see that across the Americas in your book. I think it's just completely clear.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I mean, Frantz Fanon makes that point very
Yeah.
well with Africans in the or post-Algerian Revolution, right? And um, I think that this is a good example of why we should be skeptical, you know, let me put it this way, skeptical of rendering revolution a normative term,
Mm.
in the sense that revolution necessarily leads to something better or the
Mm-hmm.
foundation of something better. Revolution is a term of political change, right? We can change things in
Yeah.
lots of different directions. Uh, and when it comes to reorganizing political societies, the story that we see over and over again is that you replace one form of, I really don't like using this term, but so called elite
Yeah.
rule with another form of elite rule. However, very importantly, there are always other options and alternatives at play. They just tend to get suppressed by those parts of society, those groups, right? So that's the thing that I think we forget. It's not that it's that, or let me say it this way: it's not that those groups are the ones best suited to rule. It's that they have the power to suppress other factions that are proposing different orders, which is again unsurprising. That happens again and again.
Yeah. and I mean, this is the work I've been trying to do in this series of saying, if you want to throw out the American Revolution because because it revolted, yeah, because it resulted in a slaveocracy. I mean, fair enough. You can throw out the outcome of it, but let's not miss all of the really exciting and liberatory things that people were doing. Although we can also admit that those people lost. Tom
Yeah,
Paine is the most
yeah.
radical of those people in the U.S. context, and he lost. But that doesn't mean we need to condemn. I mean, in some ways, the American Revolution started because Tom Paine convinced the people to start it, and we need to keep being excited and happy about that without saying that the Madisonian Constitution was the great document of freedom for all time, because it wasn't. If you haven't noticed, it wasn't.
Yeah, yeah. No, I agree. It's a matter of moving beyond binaries, beyond, you know, um, expectations of absolute purity when it comes to politics, right? Um, Even when we're talking about historical accounts of politics, given our present experience of politics, we should be mostly or entirely unsurprised at the impurity of it all.
Oh God,
So,
yes.
yeah, yeah.
All right, Arturo, I've really enjoyed this. Anything else you would like to say to wrap us up? I know we didn't talk about most of the historical examples of the book. I mean, we've got a few minutes. Whatever you'd like to say.
Uh, I think for the historical side, I think that the way we approached it was fun, and I mean, I really enjoyed it. But I also think it's really helpful in terms of um, the book isn't invested in people like really knowing their historiography. Um, I think what I'm invested in is giving people a chance to recognize how much we share in history, and that as such, we should rethink the category of history itself. How we teach it, how we relate to it, whether we nationalize it, when we nationalize it or not, and that you really see a different world when you recognize shared experience as a fundamental dimension of political, social, and cultural history. Um, and so, I hope people see that, if and when they turn to the book.
Okay, I don't think there's anything better to say. I'm happy to end it there. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Arturo. This was a real pleasure.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thanks for having me. It was fun.